So Gail, if you want to.
Okay, I want to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. I'm Gail Abler from the Emanuel Adult Education Committee, and we're pleased to welcome Professor Stuart Miller back to the Emanuel. But before introducing him, I'd like to review some of the housekeeping items that you're probably getting sick of, but they're really important for a successful program. So first, as Tammy said, this session is being recorded. So we've muted everyone's microphones and camera for the duration of the presentation. You can enter a question at any time into the chat function. We will ask the questions to Professor Miller when we get to the question and answer period near the end. We will also unmute lines at that time so you can ask questions directly. In the event, hopefully unlikely, of a Zoom bomber, please be patient with us as we remove them. We'll do so quickly and then resume our program. Now I'm pleased to welcome Professor Stuart Miller to the Emanuel Synagogue. He's an extremely knowledgeable and an excellent speaker. He received his PhD from New York University. He's a professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and chair of the Hebrew and Judaic Studies section in the Department of Literature, Cultures, and Languages. He also serves as the academic director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, and is responsible for the direction of academic offerings in Judaic Studies at UCONN. Professor Miller is a specialist in the history and literature of the Jews of Roman and late antiquity, Palestine, or antique Palestine, not sure, and has worked closely with archaeologists, most notably on the staff of the Sepphoris Regional Project, which is an important and large archaeological excavation. He has numerous publications, and he's got so much more that I could spend the whole night just talking about all of his accomplishments, but we want to hear him talk. Tonight, his topic is the real miracle of Hanukkah, why everyone's favorite minor festival should be considered a major one. And now I'm turning the program over to Professor Miller.
Thank you, Gail. And I'd like to thank the Emanuel Synagogue and the Education Committee for inviting me again. It's always a delight to be here. And I'd like to thank Gail Adler for arranging all of this. The topic, the real miracle of Hanukkah. You're probably very wondering what this is all about. Well, there's really two parts to this, and one is the miracle of the nace, the story that we all know, and a bit of history that you need to know to appreciate this festival all the more so. So I'd like to start with some observations, such as this is a minor festival from the point of view of Jewish tradition. It's also one of the most popular festivals. It's a minor festival, most likely because it's not a biblical festival. My argument will be that it should be given much more serious attention, that in some ways it's being trivialized, and we need to correct that. And we need to think more about its message. To start, the miracle. Okay, if I ask my students what is this all about, if I ask anybody what this festival is about, the first thing they're going to tell you about is the oil that lasted for 8 days. Well, to me, that's not terribly impressive. Okay, a God who creates heaven and earth and can redeem, liberate the Israelites from Egypt, I think is capable of much greater things than making oil last for 8 days. It sounds more like a magic trick. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Two, it doesn't really add up. That is that, well, this is the image you're all familiar with on the Arch of Titus. The menorah in the temple, of course, or in the Mishkan before that, was a 7-branch lampstand. So if the oil that was
Dr. Miller, you're muted.
Do I have to start again? Was I muted throughout of all of this?
No, you were not.
So where did I leave off? Just can somebody tell me?
One second before.
Oh, it was just 1 second I was muted? Okay.
No, you were muted at the last thing you said was the Arch of Titus, and then you went to mute.
Fine. Okay, so everybody knows the menorah in the temple was a 7-branch lampstand. So if you think about logically about this miracle, there was the vessel of oil was enough for one day, and it lasted for 7 days. So it was a 7-day miracle. But think more about this. You had to light all the branches of the lampstand. So maybe we should be lighting all 7 lights every single night. Think about it. Okay, so there are things that don't really add up here in how this is celebrated. So, but the main thing for me is that you go from major things that God has done, like creation of the cosmos, liberating the Israelites from Egypt, to something that really sounds like, as I said before, a magic trick. 2, point about the history. When you ask people what this is about, they'll tell you, well, there's this evil man named Antiochus, and Antiochus decided to prohibit Judaism, to create all sorts of prohibitions, making Judaism and Jewish life impossible. I'm not saying that's not true, it is true. The question is, how did that come to be? Why would that even have happened? Okay. And third, last point I want to make is that the way the story is often related is that, well, Antiochus persecuted the Jews, these Judah and the Maccabees, Matthias and the sons, 5 sons, rose in revolt. Judah was the most famous. They captured the temple. They defeated these Greeks, which is what they're always called. They weren't from Greece, by the way, but they did speak Greek. Everything was, everybody lived happily ever after. Well, that's simply not the case. What we're celebrating is the recovery of the temple, and that's essential to the historical outline I'm going to give you very shortly. Keep thinking, keep your eye on the temple, okay? And the recovery of the temple did result in the first Hanukkah. But the Hasmoneans continued to fight for over 20 years. And it wasn't until 142 that they were proclaimed independence from the Seleucids, the Syrian Greeks, not Greeks from Greece, okay? And they would be liberated in that sense. And then they would proceed to, by then they already usurped the high priesthood themselves. They weren't in line to be high priests. And they were a mixed bag in terms of leaders, with the earliest Hasmoneans being capable of leading, and the most infamous one being one of the last ones, Alexander Jannaeus, who proclaimed himself king and had a rather murderous regime. Luckily, he was married to Salome Alexandra, who turned things around after his death. But at any rate, we'll get more into this later on. What I want to start with, though, is the story, the nace of Hanukkah, the miracle, and look at that a little bit. But I do want to make it clear that I will be referring to the menorah that we call the lampstand that we use on Hanukkah. I'm going to be calling it by the modern Hebrew usage, Hanukkah, to differentiate it from the menorah of the Mishkan and of the temple. So let's be clear about it. It was Hemda ben Yehuda, the wife of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who created this modern word, which is routinely used in Israel, but I'm using it specifically so that you know which one I'm talking about. So we have an eyewitness view of somebody living in the, called the Herodian Quarter. This is a piece of graffiti, mind you. It is somebody who actually most likely saw the menorah in the temple itself, which is this was filled in by an artist here. You can see the 7 branches and the stand, which is different, incidentally, than the depiction on the Arch of Titus. which is the basis for the symbol of Israel. But at any rate, that's a whole other topic and why that may be. There could have been multiple versions of the menorah in the temple. This could be just a wrong depiction. And by the way, while I'm at it, I just have to say this: these are not Jews carrying away the menorah. These are Roman soldiers who are parading it in honor of Titus, who was already deceased, but commemorating the capture of the temple in the year 70. And anyway, let's look at the story of the miracle. This is the famous passage from the Babylonian Talmud. Mai Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah? As if we don't know what Hanukkah is. And then quotes a early tradition, the Tno Rabbanan, in Aramaic, which actually comes from a work that we're familiar with. So let me read it in English. What is Hanukkah? And what follows is in Aramaic. This is the quote from an earlier work called Megillat Ta'anit. Our rabbis taught on the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah commence. They are 8 days on which lamenting, and then in some versions, and fasting are forbidden. Now, Megillat Ta'anit is a work that scholars agree goes back to the 1st century, to the last decades before the destruction of the temple, and is a list of some 30 plus days upon which it is forbidden. It's called the scroll of fasting, but it's actually a scroll that lists days upon which it's prohibited to fast or to eulogize because they are happy occasions. All that comes from this early text is the date, and saying that this is the day, these are the days of Hanukkah. What follows is the Babylonian Talmud's amplifying of what happened. And this is the only such account. And it's in Hebrew, meaning it's a gloss on this earlier tradition. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils of the temple. And when the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed and was victorious over them, they searched and found only one vessel of oil, which was lying with the seal of the high priest on it. But there was only enough in it for one day's illumination. A miracle occurred, and they were able to light the lamp for 8 days. The following year, they established these days as a festival with songs of praise and thanksgiving. Now, it so happens that Megillat Ta'anit also has a later commentary on it. The scholars call it the Scholion. And interestingly, it does not relate this miracle. It does talk about the finding of pure oil, which was used to light the menorah, but that's all. That's all it says. And it should also be noted that the Megillat Ta'anit is thought to be a Palestinian work, meaning a work from Eretz Yisrael. This is from Bavel, from Babylonia. Now, other versions of the story exist, and they're earlier. This is one of the earliest. First and Second Maccabees are books called, are from a collection known as Apocrypha, meaning they were left out of the Tanakh. They are Jewish works. They were preserved by the church. We have them in Greek. 1 Maccabees actually was written originally in Hebrew. It has a very biblical Hebrew style, even when you read the Greek. This is what it says. Now Judah and his brothers said, now our enemies have been defeated. Let us go purify the sanctuary and restore it. Taking uncut stones as prescribed by the Torah, they built a new altar after the pattern of the old. They made new sacred vessels. They brought the candelabrum and the altar of incense and the table into the nave. I underline that to make the point that that's what they say about the light, the menorah. At the very time of the year, on the very day on which the Gentiles had profaned the altar, it was dedicated to the sound of singing and harps and lyres and cymbals. They celebrated, and this is what it's called in the Greek, the dedication of the altar for 8 days, joyfully bringing burnt offerings and sacrificing peace offerings and thank offerings. Now, Hanukkah, the word itself in the Torah, in the Tanakh, is used for Hanukkat HaMizbeach, for the pure dedication of the altar. It's also used for Hanukkat Beit Alaha in Aramaic in one of the later books, in Nezra, I think, for the dedication of the temple. So it's either the altar or the temple, but that's what the festival is called early on. Judah and his brothers and the entire assembly of Israel decreed that the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed at their time, annually for 8 days, beginning with the 25th of Kislev. with joy and gladness. Second Maccabees, written possibly a little earlier, but we're talking about two works that are written at the latter part of the 2nd century BCE. We have to know when these things occur, when the story occurs. The story of Hanukkah, meaning the Hasmonean revolt, occurs in 166, and we'll talk about that very shortly. Maccabeus and his men, that's Judah, with the Lord leading them, recovered the sanctuary and the city. After purifying the temple, they made another altar and installed the lights and set out the showbread. Again, no reference to anything other than this about the lights. On the very same date on which the temple was profaned by foreigners, occurred the purification of the temple. Katharismon is a little different word than dedication in Greek, but same idea, purification of the temple, dedication of the altar, on the 25th day of the 9th month, which was Kislev. Joyfully, they held an 8-day ceremony, celebration, after the pattern of tabernacles. I'll come back to that in a moment. Therefore, carrying ivy wreath wands and beautiful branches, fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving. They're celebrating Sukkot, except the problem here is that it's not being, it doesn't sound accurately described, okay? It doesn't sound like the Arba Minim, the 4 species, ivy wreath wands. So it's being described in very Hellenistic terms. Well, this book was written, it begins with 2 letters that encourage Egyptian Jews living in a Hellenistic world to celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, and is trying to appeal to them, and is speaking of the festival of Sukkot in terms that they would relate to. What's the connection with Sukkot? Well, there's a long-standing theory that what has happened here is that the reason the festival is 8 days is because Sukkot wasn't celebrated earlier on, which 2 Maccabees actually tells us as well, and they missed it. It was the last major of the 3 great pilgrimage festivals of the Jews. It was the most recent one, and they're a couple months late, so they decided to celebrate that festival. Of course, that would include Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, which closes out the whole pilgrimage festival cycle. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Josephus, 1st century, this is later. That was 100 and almost 200 years earlier. Josephus is writing in his Antiquities in the 90s of the 1st century CE. And so Judah, together with his fellow citizens, celebrated the restoration of sacrifices in the temple for 8 days. They made a law that their descendants should celebrate the restoration of the temple service for 8 days. And from that time to the present, we observe this festival, which we call the Festival of Lights, Kalutes Altain Phota. Phota means lights. Given this name to it, I think, from the fact that the right to worship appeared to us at a time when we hardly dared hope for it. Josephus doesn't know what the association with lights is in the 1st century. All I can say is that the 2nd book of Maccabees, which we just looked at, relates in one of those letters to the Egyptian Jews that this is a dedication of the temple, much like the dedication of the Mishkan under Moses, and the dedication under Solomon, both of which arguably were week-long, and then with a final celebration day, 8 days. And that since the time of the first temple, a fire was hidden away, and eventually that fire, the oil for that fire was found by Ezra, and was used to ignite the menorah in the 2nd temple. So it's a confusing story. It doesn't add up, but the point is that the fire is part of the story. Light is part of the story in a sense, because you needed the fire not just to light the altar, but to light the menorah. So Josephus seems to know of this kind of connection. But again, none of these sources, these are our earliest sources, and we throw in Megillat Ta'anit, relate anything, and they're all from Palestine except for 2nd Maccabees, perhaps. None of them are relating the miracle that is famous and known from the Babylonian Talmud. Psikta Rabbati is a Palestinian product of Eretz Yisrael from around the 6th or 7th century. It's a midrashic work, and it asks, "V'lama madlik nerot b'Hanukkah?" Why are lights lit on Hanukkah? On account of what transpired when the sons of the Hasmonean, the high priest, were victorious over the kingdom of Greece, as it says, "And I will arouse you, your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Yavan." That means Yavan is Greece. This is in Zechariah chapter 9. They entered the temple and found there 8, but Megillat Ta'anit has this tradition as well, 7 spits of iron, and they affixed them and kindled lights within them. So there's some confusion here. Mattatyahu was never a high priest, and by the 6th, 7th century, they're confusing the celebration of the festival for 8 days with 8 lights with what Megillat Ta'anit correctly says were 7 spits of iron. But the point is that they are setting up a menorah. That's the tradition, the 6th, 7th century. They're telling the story of establishing a new menorah in the temple in Jerusalem. No allusion to the nace as we know it from the Babylonian Talmud. Now, I can point to a lot of medieval sources which also relate various versions of this, but this is really, I want to take you to the modern period, to 1829 to 1908, the life of the famed Rabbi Yechiel Michael Epstein from Lithuania, the author of a halachic work known as the Aruch HaShulchan. This is what he says. And the truth is that they imitated the dedication of the Mishkan, meaning the Hasmoneans, which consisted of 7 days of consecration. And on the 8th day, they completed the preparation of the service in the Mishkan by Aaron and his sons, as it is related in the Torah in Vayikra. And so King Solomon dedicated the first temple, as it is written in Divrei Hayamim in Chronicles. Solomon kept the feast for 7 days. On the 8th day, they had a solemn gathering. And so to commemorate this day, they called it Hanukkah, from the language of the dedication of the altar, Chanukah Mizbeach, and of the temple, Chanukah Bayit. And another reason is explained in the book of the Hasmoneans, and he's referring to 2 Maccabees. He's not referring to Megillat Antiochus, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a medieval work with very confused work with a lot of these traditions in it, but they're drawing from this much earlier period. He knows 2 Maccabees. Because of the decrees of Antiochus, the bringing of sacrifices was annulled on the previous festival of Sukkot and on Shmini Atzeret. Therefore, in commemoration of this, they instituted the 8 days of Hanukkah. This is the famed author of the Aruch HaShulchan accepting what 2 Maccabees is saying. But look what he does with the Nes Hanukkah as known from the Babylonian Talmud. Obviously, when they were shown from the heavens the miracle of the lighting with a single vessel of oil, they gleaned from this that they approved above in the heavens, that is, to the 8 days of celebration, which is why it says in the tractate Shabbat that the following year they established these days as a festival. That is, after they received word from God, so to speak, that there was approval from above. This is a remarkable anthology, really, of many of the traditions I just discussed with you. Now the history, and we'll come back to the real miracle in the third part of my presentation. What you have here is, a map which includes Syria, Palestine, Eretz Israel, of course. But this is the Hellenistic Empire after Alexander the Great. Now, briefly, Alexander the Great is remembered for good in tradition. Only the Jews would tell a story that has Alexander the Great meet the high priest, and Alexander bows down to the high priest. That's not the way it works in Hellenistic history. It's usually the opposite. Only we have the chutzpah to tell such a story. There are many rabbis in antiquity. Many Jews have been named Alexander since antiquity. Alexander the Great's relationship with the Jews was fine. So was that of the Ptolemies for the most part, and the Seleucids, the 2 families of officers that descend from officers who took over his empire after his kingdoms, I should say, after his death in 332 BCE. Now, the Ptolemies, named after Ptolemy, the P is not pronounced, would establish the Ptolemaic Empire, which would include Israel, ancient Israel, Palestine, and the Seleucids Empire was to the east for the most part. As you move later and later into the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids would battle over Palestine. They both wanted possession of it. So the Seleucid kings would want to wrest control over Palestine from the Ptolemies. They would eventually succeed in doing that in 199. The problem was, well, before I get to the problem, the leader who would do that was a man by the name of Antiochus, but not the bad guy of our story, of our history, but his father, Antiochus Megas, Antiochus the Great. Now, Antiochus the Great obviously has a reverence and perhaps a complex, an Alexander the Great complex. He sees himself as a kind of a second Alexander. Now, in terms of the Jews, Antiochus Megas, once he gains control of their land, of Eretz Yisrael, he in fact is quite good to them. He supports the temple, sends contributions, relieves the priestly families of taxes. Relations are fine, okay? So what happens? What happens since Alexander the Great, Antiochus Megas, Antiochus the Great? What changes in a generation? Well, this is what happens. Antiochus the Great had greater designs, much like Alexander the Great. This wasn't good enough here. He wanted a greater kingdom. And he moved into Asia Minor. And of course, he, as I said, already gained control of Palestine, but he wanted to move farther into Asia Minor and beyond. The problem was there was a new kid on the block. The new kid on the block were the Romans, and the Romans would have nothing of it. And eventually he would do battle with the Romans, with cities here in Asia Minor, very large, important cities. And eventually the Romans would defeat him in the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE. 2 years later, this is Antiochus the Great, one of his coins. 2 years later, Antiochus the Great would be forced into an agreement, the Peace of Apamea with Rome. Now, this peace sounds like a modern kind of treaty, except it's an ancient one. There were war indemnities, and this is the most important thing you need to keep in mind. From now on, the Seleucids, the descendants of Antiochus Megas, would have to pay yearly tribute to the Romans. And it was humiliating and it was onerous. 12,000 talents, a ton of grain that had to be produced every year. They had to pay for destroying various cities, and they had to pay Pergamum, for example, that city. They would have to return war prisoners. There were limitations on their armaments. They would have to return elephants, which were the tanks of antiquity, so to speak. And Antiochus the Great was barred from any type of intention of conquering Asia Minor. Now, this is important to keep in mind, especially the indemnities, the monies that he's now going to owe, because he's going to bequeath that burden to his son, Antiochus Epiphanes. So let's now switch to that story, the story of what's going on in Jerusalem. Well, we have a little hint of a concern in Jerusalem by a writer who wrote during this period in the 190s. His name is Ben Sirah, also responsible for a work that's in the Apocrypha. It's actually quoted in the Talmud in a number of places. Woe to you, the ungodly men who have forsaken the law of the Most High. So here, this is the time of Antiochus Megas, okay? Receive strangers, alotrion, into your home, and they will stir up trouble for you and will make you a stranger to your own family. So Ben Sira is worried about some things, but we're not quite sure if, and it turns out that he's prescient. He's fearful. This isn't xenophobia. He's just worried about the inroads of some of the culture that's now making its way into life in Jerusalem. But he has no clue as to what follows. This is what follows. Ben Sira is writing in Jerusalem in the 190s. The Peace of Apamea in 188. I put this all on the chart so you can follow it. Usually I hand this out. This is a humiliating pact. Now follow this. This is the stuff that you really need to understand. The story of Hanukkah does not start with a revolt against the Antiochus and the Seleucids. It starts as an internal battle. This is an internal struggle for defining what Judaism is going to look like and what Jewish life is going to look like. In 175, Jason, the brother of the high priest, whose name was Onias, managed to purchase the high priesthood, to bribe his way into securing the position from Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Simple answer. Why would this happen? What interest? Money. It's about being able to turn over bigger bucks than his brother. Luckily, he's of a high priestly family. There's no big uproar about this in Jerusalem. In fact, part of the bribe not only was more tribute, but also included building a gymnasium in Jerusalem and effectively turning the city into a polis, into a Greek city-state. No problem in Jerusalem at this point. In fact, the sources tell us that we hear about priests running around naked in the gymnasium and then doing their service at the temple. No conflict yet, no contrast, no tension over this. Now, gymnasium, of course, is a school, and only in America is it a place where you play basketball. In the rest of the world, the gymnasium is still a school. But in the antiquity, it was a place where you learned, if you were a young man, how to become a Greek citizen. You learned about the gods, you learned about Homer, you read Homer, and you, of course, displayed athletic prowess. The problem with bribing yourself into the high priesthood is that two can play the same game. And within a short time, in 3 years, a man by the name of Menelaus usurps the high priesthood. And it's not clear that he belonged to a high priestly family. He usurps the high priesthood from Antiochus, who is in increasing need of funds, of money, and he gains the high priesthood. Jason is now suffered from the same fate that he inflicted upon his brother. Menelaus outbids him. He becomes high priest. And within a short time, Menelaus realizes he can't pay up. So he sells holy objects, appurtenances belonging to the temple, off to non-Jews. So he's desecrating the temple. Keep this in mind. The temple is the centerpiece here, is the focus. Keep your eye on the ball here. He sells objects belonging to the temple and instigates the murder of the legitimate high priest. We don't want Onias coming back. He's the one person who stands in the way of my continuing to be high priest. Well, now he is attacked. He's defiled two major aspects of Klei Kadosh of the temple, of the holy temple. He's sold off holy objects belonging to the temple, and he's murdered the high priest, who's his holy high official. This leads to unrest. This is where the revolt begins, and it's an internal revolt. It's civil strife. Jews are fighting other Jews. They are killing other Jews. They want Jason or Onias, but of course they can't have Onias. They'll take Jason. Jason's a Hellenizer. But that kind of Hellenism did not cross the red line, and it didn't touch upon the temple. Once the temple's involved, the red line's been crossed. The discontent grows. What happens next is that Antiochus, we're talking about Epiphanies here, of course. Epiphanies meaning God made manifest. His father only thought that he was great. Antiochus thinks he's God, right? So Antiochus Epiphanes may be keeping out of Asia Minor to stay out of the Roman hair, so to speak, but he makes his way to Ptolemaic Egypt because he has designs on Egypt. And he's on his return from his first attempt to conquer Ptolemaic Egypt, he plunders the temple, takes the incense altar and the other gold. Why does he do this? Because there's this tumult in Jerusalem, and he wants to, you know, keep the peace, wants to make sure his man's in place and ensure that Menelaus is the high priest. A year later, he's down in Egypt again, and he almost conquers Ptolemaic Egypt, except the Romans show up. The famous story, their legate Papilius Linus draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus Epiphanes and says, "You're not going anywhere. You're going to agree to leave." And that's what he does, humiliated like his dad was with a piece of Apamea by the Romans once again. Now, he's not in a good mood, and he's got to make his way through Palestine to get back to Syria, okay? And he does. And there's a rumor in Jerusalem that he's dead. Now, Mark Twain's favorite quote, you know, about his death being a great rumor. That's what happens here. He's not dead, but there's unrest in Jerusalem as he's making his way to Jerusalem. Why? Because the faction that wants Jason back, because they didn't want somebody who defiled the temple, is once again at it. Well, he comes to Jerusalem now in no mood for diplomacy. He restores Menelaus once again. He tears down, he raises the walls of Jerusalem. And he stations Syrian, Seleucid troops in proximity to the temple. And on the 15th of Kislev in 167, Antiochus institutes prohibitions against Sabbath, against Shabbat, festivals, circumcision, and sacrifices. Why? Well, he's trying to get at what he thinks is the problem. The problem is the Jews are just too Jewish. There are scholars who believe that he had instigators here amongst the Jews, which makes perfectly good sense. It wouldn't, you know, take much for Menelaus to advise him. He says, you know, it's really our practices that are the problem. My point in emphasizing this is an internal as much as an external challenge. So 1 Maccabees remembers these as decrees as an attempt to forget the Torah, to forcefully forget the Torah and get Jews to violate their commandments. On the 25th of Kislev, he installs an abomination of desolation on the altar of the temple, and Zeus, according to some sources, is worshipped on the altar. Well, it wouldn't take long for the Jews to rise and revolt. And there's where Mattathias, Mattatyahu, and his sons enter the picture. You know the famous story. The Seleucid soldiers make their way to Modi'in. They compel Jews to bring pagan sacrifices. Mattathias rises in revolt, kills one of the Jews, according to one of the sources, and then heads for the hills because the revolt has begun. This is a guerrilla revolt. It's small time for now, but it will become big time as things evolve. In 164, Judah, his son, he's gone by now. His dad's gone by now. Judah captures the temple. This war is going to continue. This is a temporary peace, so to speak. He captures the temple with his supporters, and he rededicates the altar and the temple. You rededicate the altar, you're rededicating, of course, the temple with it to the God of the Jews, to the sound of song lyres, and cymbals, as 1 Maccabee says. But it will not be until 142 that the Maccabees under Simon, one of the other sons, would declare that the yoke of the heathen was taken away from Israel. In between, one of the other brothers, Jonathan, after Judah's death in battle, would take over the high priesthood, something maybe we can talk about in the question and answer period, because they didn't have a legitimate right to the high priesthood either. Okay, let's turn back to the nace, to the miracle of Hanukkah. This will take me down the home stretch. It's a little difficult for me to see my own slides because okay, I can see what it says, publicizing the miracle. Okay, so this is also from the Babylonian Talmud, from the continuation of the sugya of the passage that we already looked at with the Nes Hanukkah. Rabbi said, it is a mitzvah to set the light of Hanukkah within a handbreadth of the doorway. Now you ask most people, where do you light the Hanukkah? You light it in the window. Some people know that the reason is because of threats to Jews, to provocative acts against them and so forth, and perhaps even course of inclement weather, that eventually it was moved indoors. Originally, this is the halacha. Rabbi said it is a mitzvah to set the light of Hanukkah within the handbreadth of the doorway. Where precisely should it be placed? Rabbi Aha, the son of Rava, said on the right. And these are Babylonians. Rav Samuel of Difti said on the left, so that the light of Hanukkah is on the left and the mezuzah is on the right. Now, this is going to take me to my take on the real miracle of Hanukkah, on the miracle of Hanukkah. I thought about this a lot. And I also looked at the later commentators on this passage. So let's have a look. First, talk about the imagery here. You have the mezuzah on the right, which is where it's supposed to be, on the right of every doorway in your house, every doorway to every appropriate room in the house. Mezuzah contains, of course, the Shema. Why is that important? Because the Shema contains, in the second paragraph, an emphasis upon keeping the covenant. Of course, it's in the mezuzah because it says in the Shema, and inscribe them, meaning the words of the Shema, which reminds one to keep the covenant, on the doorposts of your house. First and foremost, the mezuzah is a reminder, a daily reminder, a reminder throughout your home, and I want to emphasize the home now as opposed to the temple earlier on, to keep the covenant, to keep the mitzvah, to keep the Torah. But essentially that means the same thing, to keep the covenant that the ancient Israelites entered into with God. So that's on one side. That's the permanent daily reminder to keep the covenant. Opposite it, according to the Babylonian Talmud, you're to light the Hanukkah, because you have a mezuzah on one side, the Hanukkah should go on the other side. Sounds like it's a practical matter. Well, several medieval commentators point out that this is interesting because what it really suggests is that that you are that one finds oneself surrounded by mitzvot. That's nice too. I thought about this quite a bit. Okay, so on the one hand, you're thinking about, you're reminded to keep the covenant. And on the other side, you are fulfilling which mitzvah? Well, you're fulfilling not a biblical mitzvah, but a rabbinic mitzvah, because the festival of Hanukkah is a rabbinic holiday. Okay, there must be more to this. Here's my theory. First Maccabees tells us something about what happened when the Seleucids went from town to town. You heard already when they went to Modi'in, how that sparked the revolt. You heard that Mattathias was objecting to the bringing of pagan sacrifices. 1 Maccabees also tells us the following. The king had an abomination of desolation built upon the altar. I referred to that earlier. And in the outlying towns of Judah, they built illicit altars. Now, these are incense altars in most likely. And at the doors of the houses and at the doors of their homes and in the squares, they offered these illicit sacrifices. I see there being a connection here. And then the text goes on to say whatever scrolls of the Torah they found, they tore up and burned. What's the connection? Yeah, surrounded by mitzvot, for sure. No question about that. But let's think about this passage. At the doors of their homes, they were being compelled to bring a sacrifice to foreign gods. On the threshold of their homes, in the courtyards leading up to their homes. Do the rabbis later know this? I can't prove that. But it sure is interesting. Because what this ultimately means is that the covenant, the daily reminder of the covenant, is on the right. And the determination to remain Jews that we remember every year by lighting the Hanukkah opposite the mezuzah, at a time when what the mezuzah stands for, the keeping of the covenant, was undermined. That reminder is the Hanukkah, and that's to the left. There's an integral relationship between the mezuzah and the Hanukkah. It's not just being surrounded by mitzvot. There's a dynamic here. There's a relationship. Now, the placement of house altars in the Hellenistic world was common. Here you have one that was archaeologically discovered in Montenegro. And here you have a diagram from a Greek house, an altar here, in the courtyards leading into the house. And the rabbis indicate that the Hanukkah is to be set up, lit yearly at the very time of year when the commitment to the covenant was being compromised, was potentially being compromised. I'm showing you a source now from the 8th century Shi'iltot, a halachic work. This is what it says. It is a mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah to set the light of Hanukkah within a handbreadth of the doorway. Where precisely? And this quote that follows is pretty much the Babylonian Talmud with some minor variations. The last part of this, according to the one who maintains that it should be placed on the left, it is so that the mezuzah will be on the right and the light of Hanukkah on the left. And so that the head of the household can stand between them wrapped in a fringed garment, obviously meaning wearing a talit. Now, anybody who's been to Jerusalem, has lived in Israel, as we have multiple times, knows that in Jerusalem, the homes are made with a place opposite the doorway on the left with a permanent home for the Hanukkah. And so we took home a Hanukkah from Israel on our sabbatical in 1995-96. Think of this passage and have a look. That's publicizing the miracle of Hanukkah at the Miller home. The mezuzah behind me are Hanukkah from Israel, glass enclosed. Hanukkah, I'll give you a closer look in a minute. And I don't always wear a talit, but I did to make the point about what the Shi'iltot, I think, captures the connection, the Shema, the covenant, the talit, which comes from the Shema, and the Hanukkah representing every year the challenge that Jews faced at that time of year in terms of keeping the covenant. Let's have a closer look. If you want to know what the real miracle of Hanukkah is, well, 1996, we disassembled this after we purchased it. We wrapped each part of it. We put it in a suitcase, and miraculously, it made it home to West Hartford in one piece. And more than that, it lasted not only that first year in 1996, but this will be the 24th year since. So that's the real miracle of Hanukkah. Now, seriously, this is how I want to end with the following comments. The rabbis understood that the covenant, as represented by the biblical passages in the mezuzah, was threatened. They may even have been aware that the Seleucids forced their ancestors to bring pagan incense offerings, that is, to other gods, on the threshold of their homes, although I admit I cannot prove that. By insisting that the Hanukkah lights be lit opposite the mezuzah and on the threshold of the home, we Jews are symbolically and publicly proclaiming that the threat to the keeping of the eternal covenant symbolized by the mezuzah was overcome by the determination of our ancestors, despite both internal and external pressure. The irony of confusing this festival in popular culture with Christmas, which commemorates something that occurs much later, and perhaps we could talk about that as well, is quite an irony. This is a revolt against internal aggressive assimilation, as well as external pressure to assimilate. So let me repeat that. The threat to the keeping, we Jews are symbolically and publicly proclaiming that the threat to the keeping of the eternal covenant symbolized by the mezuzah was overcome by the determination of our ancestors, despite both internal and external pressure to remain Jews. The threat came from within, well before it came from without. It's a point you should keep in mind. That threat would have especially undermined the way of life practiced by Jews in their homes, that is, in their private lives. I'm working on a book called From Temple to Home to Community, because where I argue that the home is the essential vehicle after the destruction of the temple for the survival of Judaism. This is one of the manifestations of it, where the rabbis brilliantly do this. Passover is the greatest manifestation example of that. So where better to commemorate the Hasmonean victory each year than at the very place where the Jews were once compelled by the Seleucids to publicly pronounce their allegiance to other gods and to another way of life. The lighting of the Hanukkah on the threshold of one's home, or at the very least in a window, is the Jews' way of remembering what was at stake when the Hasmoneans recovered the temple and rededicated it to God. Jews who light in this fashion are indeed surrounded by the biblical commandment to place the mezuzah on the doorframe and the rabbinic commandment to light the Ner Hanukkah opposite. But more than anything, they are publicizing the real miracle, the successful determination of Jews to remain Jews, not only in the time of the Hasmoneans, but ever since. I believe that this is precisely what the rabbis thought should be publicized, and that it is the real miracle of Hanukkah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. We're going to open up the room for questions. Just give us a moment to get that all set.
We want to unmute all, I think, right?
Yep.
I don't have the ability to do that.
Ask everyone to start their videos too.
Okay, everyone should be able to unmute themselves.
You can also use the chat feature if you'd like to throw a question in the chat, and we will make sure that Professor Miller gets that question.
Nothing in the chat. I can't seem to unmute.
I'll ask a question.
Good.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. A question about your Sukkot and Hanukkah connection.
Emma, it's your turn.
Do you
Your
think
turn.
do you think it has to do with do you think there's a connection in terms of the Bikurim about the first fruits? That might be what the the book of Maccabees is referring to, as opposed to the festival?
The
Oh, I could also get you, but I'm trying to
the
get here.
we have a similar
So
description
you will
in at
be
least one other help. In at least one,
Amen.
I'm hearing everybody. I don't know if it, yes, okay. We have a similar description, the use of the word thyrsos for the wand in another, in a completely Hellenistic source to describe Sukkot. So I don't necessarily think so. I think it's just, 2 Maccabees is a more foreign work than 1 Maccabees. 1 Maccabees feels much more Jewish. As I said, it's written almost like biblical Hebrew, but it's in Greek. It seems to be appealing to a more Hellenized audience. So I think they're using familiar language and familiar imagery, that's all. Questions?
Please feel free to unmute. If you're having trouble unmuting, please add your name into the chat and we'll get to you if you have questions.
No, can I make a comment?
Yep.
I just loved you two. First of all, the real miracle of Hanukkah being bringing the menorah all the way back from Israel to here as being a miracle. I thought that was wonderful. We have something like that too. But I also really like it's beautiful. The other, I think I understood it, the symbolism of the real miracle is how we continue to live our lives as Jews. Is that?
I think the rabbis, of course, speak in terms of Pirsumei Nisa, the obligation to publicize the miracle. As I like to say, I often say when I do this presentation, that I've always found strange too. Nobody's ever knocked on my door and say, "So tell me about this festival." And I'll tell them, well, this oil lasted for 8 days. Wow, what a miracle. That's not really how they react. And of course, the Pirsum, the publicizing of miracles for Jews as well, which you have to keep that in mind. I mean, the halachot are about having people home when you light the lights. Okay, so the point is that I think there's a realization when you look at halakha, the laws, you have to look at them and understand that there's ideas behind them. And it's not just, so you have to publicize, you need somebody to publicize too. No, I think that publicizing in the home to other Jews, or if you live in Jerusalem to other Jews, clearly, is because there's an understanding that there is an internal as well as an external threat here. And so that's what we're remembering and we're commemorating this determination to remain Jews. And I think that the traditional miracle that's told in the Babylonian Talmud perhaps was an attempt to spiritualize, as some have claimed, a political matter, but I'm not sure it was that. I think the rabbis see this as lights that are supposed to recollect the larger story that I'm telling. And unfortunately, we've moved away from a historical consciousness. And, and in the process, we end up trivializing things. It becomes, you know, bad guys beat us up and we went home and partied, that kind of thing. And Jewish life and Jewish history is much more serious than that. We at least ought to know when these things happen and what really happened.
Stu, I thought that where you were going was that we were going to put the Hanukkah on the left because the altars were there.
Well, we don't know. The altars were in the courtyards, sometimes in the homes, and certainly on the threshold of the home. But what I'm saying is that's close enough for me. Okay, they're in the doorway. They're on their way into the house, oftentimes. Not all the time. Sometimes internal courtyards and so forth. But we know they are there. And what the home comes to represent here, as certainly after the destruction of the temple in 70. Is, to my mind, an important conduit for practices that were even associated with the temple. And we treat the table on which we eat our food and how we come to that food as if it's a shulchan, as if it's a mizbeach, as if it's an altar. And many of the practices, the Passover Seder was not a Seder, and it didn't exist. It was a rite that was done at the temple in Jerusalem. It was brilliantly transformed into something that we could relate to and carry on with after the destruction of the temple. I think this is all part of that. And so the home becomes, as you enter the home and remember the covenant in that very first doorway, and then from doorway to doorway, but nevertheless, as you enter the home, and opposite it is the very place where you were being compelled to desecrate this commitment, is interesting to me, to say the least. And that's where I was going with it.
Thank you.
One interesting thing that people don't know is that the word Hellenism is first used in 1 Maccabees, and so is the word Judaism for the first time. They're not used as contrasts, but they're both used in there for the first time. It's interesting, you know, we use Hellenism. What Hellenistic historian, what ancient historian doesn't use the term? So it's a term that's created in a sense to capture not just Greek culture, it's the intermingling of cultures, which is what Hellenistic empires, Hellenistic kingdoms sought to do, which is to, you know, the local gods would be construed as the same as the gods, the Greek gods, and so forth. Hellenism is not just Greek culture, but that wasn't going to work with Judaism when it come to their religious tenets, when it came to their religious rites. It could work in terms of running around in the gymnasium, but the red line was the temple, and that was respected by Alexander earlier, and certainly by Antiochus Epiphanes' father. But as you saw, things unraveled when political exigencies entered the picture.
Okay, Avi wants to ask a question, but he can't unmute.
Okay, somebody is Shane is asking me, Toby is asking me about the when first and second Maccabees were written. A very complicated problem, and first Maccabees takes us into the history of the later Hasmoneans. First Maccabees is more concerned about the revolt, and second Maccabees has these 2 letters that may not have been written at the same time as the book. Is based upon a history of Jason of Cyrene. It's really very complicated, and I really can't get into. But what I am simply saying is that both of these works are written in this latter part of the 2nd century BCE, according to most authorities, and which was earlier or later is a complicated question.
Gail, it's Avi. Could I ask a question?
Yeah, please. Go
Okay,
ahead.
good. I can't turn on my camera, but that's okay. As long as you can hear me, it's fine. So, Stuart, thank you for a great lecture. Really fascinating. And I wanna ask about sort of this. I'm very interested in the idea of heroes and heroism. Um, and in sort of the Zionist reading of history and in Israel, the idea of the Maccabim and well, actually in Israel now, if you talk about Maccabi, you're either talking about basketball or soccer or beer, yeah, or healthcare.
Right.
But it is interesting that there's such an emphasis on the idea of heroism, right? About the Maccabees and the ideal of sort of the strong, heroic Jewish fighter, and that's the ideal that's sort of emphasized. But if I'm hearing your interpretation correctly, right, that's actually kind of a misreading of the history in terms of that what should be emphasized is the rededication of the covenant of a turn to mitzvot. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of where this, if there's any in the thinking of the rabbis, where sort of the idea of these heroes plays in, or if that is really played down, and that this is just kind of a modern Zionist rereading of the Hanukkah story.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this, Avi. Thanks. So there have been many different readings of the history, okay, here, and
What's that?
there was a time when the argument was made that the rabbis downplayed the whole Hasmonean regime, which lasted around 100 years, if you count from the beginning of from the time of the revolt down through Alexander Jannaeus, Alexander Yanai, the last very significant self-proclaimed king, Hasmoneans. Now, there's several issues here. The medieval authority Ramban Nachmanides points out that, the Hasmoneans weren't entitled to become kings. They're not of the house of Judah. They're not rightful rulers. And by the same token, you can't have high priests who rule, okay? And what's remarkable about the Hasmoneans is they took on both powers. In 152, Jonathan the Hasmonean takes over, becomes high priest, because there wasn't a high priest in sight, apparently. So he becomes a high priest. He does belong to a high priestly family. He is a priest, but that would have to suffice. And then by 142, his brother Simon is proclaiming himself hegemon or ethnarch, a Hellenistic ruler. And then later on, a descendant Alexander Aristobulus and then Alexander Janai are calling themselves kings. Later Hasmoneans are calling themselves kings. So Ramban points out that they're desecrating the high priesthood by not only they're not legitimate rulers, they're desecrating the high priesthood by possessing both of these responsibilities, by claiming both of these responsibilities. Interesting arguments against, or for, I should say, separation of church and state, but in whether here or in Israel, but let's not go there. So taking Ramban's, one could project that upon the earlier rabbis of the Talmudic period, and say they must have objected to this. And there are some signs that they did, that could have been a problem, but I don't think they're very convincing. And there's another argument that they want to just downplay the whole political might. And that was an argument that was very, very popular. The rabbis preferred a much more diplomatic, pacifistic approach. I'm a child of the 60s. That resonates with me, but I'm afraid as a historian, it doesn't work, okay? The rabbis, Hanerot Halalu, Al Hanisim, talk about at least allude to the victories. There's no problem there. Although I will argue that the rabbis do show signs of preferring, perhaps because they didn't have power. They live for the most part, after the destruction of the temple. There are very few rabbis from the time of the temple itself. Hillel himself's not called rabbi. But if we start with Hillel, we're talking about within 70, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years at most before the destruction of the temple, where he starts hearing of sages who would eventually be called rabbis. But the point is that, in answer to your question, Avi, the reverse happens as you get to the modern, to push for the modern state of Israel. And historians of Israel, Zionist historians, if you will, would turn this around. And much as they did with the Masada story, which is not what it's cracked up to be, would turn this into a kind of heroic event. I'm afraid the history just isn't there to support that, okay? I'm not saying they weren't heroic, but that's not what's being valorized by the rabbis. It's being remembered, and that's a very different thing.
I have a question from Susan Fetterman. She can't seem to unmute, so I'm going to ask it for her.
Sure.
It says, when did the transition occur between the concept you mentioned and the miracle of oil in present practice?
I'm sorry, ask that again?
When did the transition occur between the concept you mentioned and the miracle of oil in present practice? Oh, here she's. Susan, can you talk now?
Hi, can you hear? Hello?
I can hear you, yes.
I don't quite understand if it started with this idea of religious practices and, dedication to the covenant, and then it evolved into something with the candles and this sort of trivial holiday we have today. When did that occur? Was there ever a point where...
It's a good question. Maybe I wasn't clear on this point. I'm not saying there was an evolution. I'm saying that lying behind the images, lying behind the symbols of this festival are much larger, the much larger history and a much more meaningful message than is often conveyed. That's what I'm saying. Now, what I will say, though, is a very question, because this question remains, is when did this emphasis upon the celebration as a celebration with lights take off to the degree that it did? And more importantly, why is the standard Nes Hanukkah, which is told, and which I tell my kids and my grandchildren now, and we should all tell, when did that take off and why? And the question, and that I think is very simple. I think that in Babylonia, the rabbis had very different interests than the rabbis in Eretz Israel. I've written a lot about this. And the Babylonian Talmud would eventually be a decisive when it comes to there are two Talmuds, of course. There's a Talmud of the land of Israel, sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, certainly not the Jerusalem Talmud, because Jews weren't living in Jerusalem at the time, but it's still called that. And the Babylonian Talmud. Now, it's the Palestinian Talmud, the Talmud of the land of Israel, which is a mouthful, is not an insignificant work and does play a role in the history of halakha. There are halachot that only come from the Yerushalmi, from that particular Talmud. But the story, this does not occur in the Palestinian tradition. I showed you that today. It occurs in the Babylonian tradition. Now, some have argued, and this is being debated now, that there's a Zoroastrian background to all of this. The Zoroastrians in Persia and in Babylonia, the place where the Babylonian rabbis live, worship fire. And maybe this is why the rabbis are emphasizing this particular aspect. But what I will say, and this is being argued by a number of people today, whether there is something to that or not, the fact is that the story, my Hanukkah in Masechet Shabbat, in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, will have much more influence than the traditions of Eretz Yisrael because it's the Babylonian Talmud. It's the most complete Talmud, even though it's not complete, and even though it doesn't have some material that the Talmud of the Land of Israel has. Nevertheless, it will become much more influential as time marches on, and the legacy will be that this is the story of our tradition. It's really as simple as all that, but it's not. But as you saw, and as I said earlier, there are medieval authorities. I quoted Rabbi Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan fame. There are plenty of rabbis who know these other traditions, and we're just as perplexed by them as modern historians.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'll be glad to answer any more questions. I'm not going anywhere.
If anyone needs help unmuting, chat or send a message in the chat or something, and we'll try and help. For some reason, we're having some technical difficulties here.
No one has a question. I just want to follow up on your point to Avi. In terms of proof that the Talmudic rabbis disapproved of the combining of two branches of government, do you think that the decision, the liturgical decision about like the Haftorah and the comparison between Zechariah and the vision of Zechariah plays a role in that? And even the placement of the menorah between those two, between the mezuzah and the menorah, might be evocative of that vision of, if you follow the right commands, that Yoshua the Kohen Gadol is warned, then you can walk between Bein Hamudim Ha'ele, between these two pillars. That is almost like a tacit rebuke of the Chashmonaim for their.
As I said, there are plenty of people, scholars, who've argued that there is a rebuke here of the Hasmoneans. I have a colleague, Daniel Schwartz at Hebrew University, who's tried to read Josephus in this way, certain passages that have to do with Alexander Jannaeus and forerunner of the Hasmoneans, John Hyrcanus, in this fashion. Any rate, I think we should write this sermon together. I could work with that. That's really.
I mean more reading the Talmud that way.
Yeah,
meaning as sort of to Avi's point, in that's that might be proof of their rebuke of them at the earlier stages.
Right. So the Talmud has a model of the traditions from Josephus pertaining to the careers of John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus, where one of them is rebuked for holding on to both offices. And the problem is, I just did this in a graduate course of mine, is that what exactly the Alexander Jannaeus or John Hyrcanus is being rebuked for which office, for holding which office is not clear, or whether holding both of them is the problem. But it's clear that that's what is the issue in Ramban. So now that tradition of Josephus is known to the rabbis, as you well know, even though they muddle, even though they mix, they have things a little bit confused. So yeah, I don't have any problem with that. I just don't think that that's the main thrust of the rabbinic. What I'm saying is, in answer to an earlier question, which connects with this, I don't think that leads us to this story in Masechet Shabbat and the emphasis on that by the rabbis. I don't see that as an attempt to squelch Hasmonean history for any reason, whatever reason. But do I think the rabbis would have had the early rabbis would have had the same problem as Ramban did because of the image in the Haftarah, or for whatever other reason, because they understood that Shevet Yehuda is supposed to produce the king, and for that matter, the Mashiach. And the high priesthood is from a different tribe altogether. Yeah, I can live with that. Yeah, I think we should work on this sermon together.
And then you can read Maimonides as redeeming that tradition, in his code where he writes very strongly about that. So
Yep. Great.
Anyone else have any questions? We're coming on 9 o'clock.
Somebody's connecting.
Really, we have a couple minutes. Now's your chance. I think it's given us a lot to think about, a lot of questions that are really pretty deep, I guess.
One thing that I would have liked to have said, and while we're waiting, because I see somebody trying to connect, is that what happens after the revolt? We know from the sources from before the revolt and after the revolt that there's the question after the revolt is no longer about Hellenizing. The Hasmoneans are Hellenized. They don't compromise the temple, okay? They don't go as far as Menelaus, but they are Hellenized. So that interesting questions as to the extent upon which, to which assimilation is a challenge. But more to the point is that the sources that follow from this period, Dead Sea Scrolls, other materials that we have, expansions upon biblical traditions and so forth, indicate that what's going on is an internal discussion, internal debates, really an introspection and internal battles between different types of Jews who exist during this period. So the full-blown assimilation is not the issue. That's not on the table anymore. Similarly to after the destruction of the first temple and the Jews returned, we're not as concerned yet anymore about Baal worship, which was a concern in the first temple period. Now, why I'm telling you that is because, why I'm mentioning this is because the whole complexion of Judaism could have been different. It could have looked very different. And the irony there is that the Pharisees, who in some ways are the predecessors of the rabbis, I don't identify them as actually their predecessors, but nevertheless, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Dead Sea sect, the Essenes, all these different groups that exist, all these are working on different ways of implementing a Torah in daily life. That's what they're doing. And the point is that out of this mix also comes Jesus. Okay, Jesus, who I spoke about, I think at Emanuel just a few years ago. I think that was my discussion, if I remember correctly, and the separation between Judaism and what eventually becomes Christianity. Jesus would not have been the type of Jew he was, which I argued was a pretty observant and certainly knowledgeable Jew, had this revolt not played out the way it did, and had history not played out the way it did, and had not all these forces and discussions of biblical tradition taking place in the lead up to his own life. So there's a real irony here in the popular culture confusing these two celebrations. They're quite distinct, but there is a certain connection in terms of Jewish history.
Any other questions? Anything more that you want to add to this already very interesting conversation? You and I are the only ones who are not muted. When I look at my screen, everyone is muted and can't seem to unmute. Really a shame. Really would be a great opportunity. I'm sure there's a lot more questions, but since no one can say anything, I guess we'll have to end here. And I want to thank you very much.
I just like to say before I leave, and that means leave my room, leave my study. First of all, Chag Hanukkah Sameach to everybody. And I live here in West Hartford, over on Wilshire Lane. And if you want to see us light outside, just zip by on the Haynes Road side of the house during Hanukkah, and hopefully you'll be there at the time when we're lighting.
Oh, very nice. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Wear your mask.
Did you want to say something? Yes.
Just to say goodbye.
Okay, goodbye. Thank you for being here.